Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. I'm excited to be actually talking about economics this time. The last episodes, we were discussing the issue of abortion and ethics and metaphysics. Now we're going to try to get a bit more practical. Today I have on the show Raheem Williams. He is an active economist. He writes for The Policy, the Reason Foundation, Intellectual Takeout, and the Foundation for Economic Education. I think I hit all of them. And today we're going to discuss school choice, gun control, taxation, and economic policy, those basic three areas. So, Raheem, can you just introduce yourself to the audience? And also, if I'm not mistaken, The Policy is your think tank. Is that correct? Or you write for them? Or what's the whole idea
Okay,
there?
so The Policy is more of a kind of a blog that I started. It's not exactly a think tank, and it's open source in the sense that I accept submissions from all ideologies. It's not necessarily a conservative or a right-leaning bent. I mean, my writing is, admittedly, I'll go ahead and establish my own bias ahead of time for the audience. And so basically what I do in terms of for a living, I'm a policy analyst for the Reason Foundation. I'm not really speaking in that capacity though. As a free thinking individual and whatnot, I also have a formal training in economics, and that's in public policy. I basically just love policy. That's really where it was. I just had like an hour-long conversation about education reform, abortion as well, and then additionally foreign policy, which isn't something we're hitting on here, but it's like I just love policy. Policy is a great place to be because it's all about the rules and the structures that we live under. So let's talk about it.
So yeah, your mind is kind of oriented more towards the practical questions of, how do we solve a problem? What laws do we pass? Or, I mean, are you also interested in the abstract and theoretical questions as well? Or
I mean, I believe I like to pride myself on kind of diving in, taking it from theoretical to practical, kind of bridging those gaps from theory to reality. And that's what I do with a lot of things in regards to economics. That's what I do with a lot of things in regards to even political philosophy. And I think all of these things have like different effects on the general populace.
Right. Well, let's dive right into our first issue. So our first issue is going to concern school choice. So let me kind of provide some context for where I'm asking these questions from. I think it's obvious that for some odd reason, well, I not for an odd reason, but in my estimation, what it seems to be the case is that people are very fired up about this issue. Like, how should we raise our kids? How should we educate them? The public school system seems to be lagging behind, and people say the cause is because public schools don't have enough money. But then people are responding, no, there are inherent structural problems with the public education system. And the debate just goes on and on and on. So I want you to just kind of provide for the audience some context for what's right now going on in the debate. What are the main sides that are proposing their visions on the issue? And why do you think the disagreement is so personal? Or at least it runs so deep?
Well, I mean, it's an important issue because everybody's concerned about, the children. The children are our future. That is when we allow them to be born. The children are our future. So with school choice and school reform, and this is a debate where is the solution, there isn't one clear solution. So a lot of people are looking for like one very set definitive answer. And it's like, you can't find that answer because it's a multivariate problem. There's different issues, like urban schools aren't the same as rural schools, so you have those issues where it's like, okay, so what works here in North Dakota may not be best for Kansas, which may not be best for Texas or Florida or California. So those are things we have to look at. In terms of funding, there are studies that show that funding has immense effect. And then there's studies that show like there's very little on the margins in terms of changes in funding. So there's some truth to both sides. Like, let's say for a radical example, if we reduce all school funding to $0, I think it's fair to say you would see some decline in performance at the very least. So it's like, it's intellectually dishonest, and it's also practically dishonest. Like, it's just dishonest in every sense of the word to say that funding doesn't matter. Absolutely it does, but it's not the only thing that matters. I'm going to go ahead and Roland Fryer, for example, he's a Harvard economist that basically made a name for himself in terms of school reform and education reform research. And he did a lot of work that was fairly favorable to school choice, but he also did work that looked at basically good schools in general. There are good schools that are traditional public schools. There are good schools that are charter schools, but there are also really crappy traditional public schools.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also really crappy charter schools. So, and even, you know, crap private schools. Like, it's like these kind of things happen. So it's like he looked, he was like, okay, so what do good schools have in common, regardless of if they're public, for-profit, charter, or, you know, whatever you want to call it, these varying structures. And what was found is discipline. Discipline is probably the biggest indicator. It's schools that had zero tolerance policies in terms of behavior issues and missing work that generally created the best performance. Now, there's an ethical issue here. There's a lot of people on a more progressive side that takes issue with zero tolerance policies, because what it does is it takes, especially in urban neighborhoods where a lot of these charters are set up and whatnot, it takes problem kids and it throws them out on the streets, which is the last place you want a problem child. So they basically, but there's also the externality, like when a child's a disruption in the classroom, it makes it harder for everybody to learn. And when that child is repetitively or chronically a disruption and they always come back, it sets a poor example. It lets the other kids know, like, hey, I can act out, and whatever happens, they're going to have to let me back in. That's kind of the issue at traditional public schools. It's always discipline. It's discipline, and that's probably like the biggest indicator of if a school outcomes, more so than anything else. But with that being said, there's also ethical issues related to discipline. It's not just something you can easily lay down. Now, as far as school funding, as I told you before, like, it's not that it doesn't matter. It's just like you could take a school somewhat, and like, let's say a very poor performing school where they have chronic discipline issues, and you can crank up funding and you might see some very small marginal gains. That's possible. That's possible. But the return you get per dollar is going to be abysmal. And that's kind of the issue with it. So it's like, it's not as simple as throwing money at the problem. And not to say money doesn't matter, but if you do just throw money at the problem, you're going to have an issue. And like I said, in terms of discipline, that's also something that starts at the home. That's something we put way too much pressure on our teachers to be both babysitters, to play mom and dad or godmom or whatever, and instead of their jobs, which is to teach. Like, teachers and administrators shouldn't be putting up with the problems they do. You see these videos on Facebook of like kids just literally blatantly fighting the teachers, like the most absurd and disrespectful things in the world, and nobody's being paid enough to deal with that. So it's like, part of the issue is we're turning our school, especially in K through 12, and this goes through other cultural issues in terms of why this is happening, why people are leaving the home and finding this acceptable behavior, is like, what you see is we're asking our teachers to be babysitters, but they're educators, and they shouldn't have to be putting up with some of the things they do. So a lot of this starts in the home, and that's another reason when you see very, very high performing schools in terms of student outcomes, is generally because those schools have a bit of a selection bias. Like private schools, they come from well-off to-do families in general, and generally two-parent households where they have a discipline structure at home. So it's generally something that our lower income communities deal with in terms of single-parent households. And I'm not trying to blame single mothers. I want to be very clear about that, because they have a very tough job. But there's no easy answer to this, and that's a recurring thing. It's like, okay, so how do we fix it? It's like, these problems, they vary widely across the country. Like here in the Midwest, we actually have fairly good K through 12 schools. Like North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, for example, they generally score very high on the SAT and ACTs. They do well in college placements. So it's like, it's not exactly, how do you say this, an overemphasis on fixing schools, but education is always the topic. Here in Fargo, for example, we're talking a lot about increasing disciplinary issues and how teachers are finding themselves in very, very awkward situations. And that's as the school district becomes more and more urbanized. And how do you fix that? How do you address it? And my best response to that is like, you're going to have to find a way to maintain disciplinary standards and basically set expectations for students who may not be used to having much expected of them.
Right. And what I really appreciate about your approach is that it seems really nuanced and reasonable, because I've also kind of looked at the research myself, because I had to do some debate in high school concerning public education and all these different issues. And I just noticed that it seemed as if there wasn't really a consensus on, if it should just be one side of the aisle or the other side of the aisle. And, for in my case, in my high school, so I went through the public school system myself. My high school was ranked the top high school in Kansas. And the reason why was because, well, one, like, my high school has very high expectations for its students. It has zero tolerance policies concerning bullying and fighting. So it's a magnet school. You have to be invited in. You can get kicked out. So it has some of the functions of like a private school in there. And there's a lot of freedom for the administrators to create those policies. But before we continue, I think another issue that I'm seeing too is, you provide this nuanced perspective, but when I look at some of the literature, especially some books that have been written by liberal economists, I think they'll say something like charter schools are inherently threats to public schools, or they're taking away, or, the voucher system would somehow deprive students. And what's your take on that?
Well, I'm happy you brought that up. So that is probably one of the most prevalent myths that is perpetuated by the left. And it's like, I hate to be cynical, but it's like, you kind of can't avoid it. That's almost solely there to appease teachers' unions. Like, there's no other logical reason to believe such foolishness.
Mm.
And the reason I say that is basically what it comes down to is, why do we pay for schools? Why do we care about public education? And that's because we see that there are positive externalities to educating the next generation. Like, I don't want to be surrounded by idiots. I like the fact that my neighbor can read. I like the fact that I can send you messages. Like, a lot of what we do, is, especially even in the media in terms of policy and all that stuff, is based on the idea that people, at least graduating high school, maybe even some college, have a very, very basic minimum understanding of the English language, basic understanding of mathematics and science. Like, can you even begin to explain climate change to somebody who never ever took a science class ever in their life? It's like, you see, like, these are things that you need to have as a fundamental basis, and society's better off for it. So it's like, I'm a big fan of the idea of financing public education. So we do these things, and when you measure them, it's like, okay, so what exactly is the point, or how do you know? It's like, you have different measurements of outcomes, be that GPA, be that SAT scores, be it some kind of standardized testing, however you want to measure outcomes. It's like, different people argue for different metrics. That's not what I want to get into. What I'm trying to say is, if it's about outcomes, then why exactly does it matter if the student attends a charter school, a private school, or a traditional public school? I would argue it doesn't. The idea of school choice is that the tax dollars that are allocated to your child will follow that child to whatever school you send it to. Now, I think it's somewhat of mental gymnastics that these anti-charter, anti-choice advocates have convinced people that it's a terrible idea for them to decide where their children go to school. Like,
Mm.
how phenomenal of a trick is that? So I'm like, wow, it's like, you know what? You can't be trusted with your child's educational decisions. Let a random bureaucrat who's never met them do it. So I was like, how does that even make sense in your head? But let's go back to this. Like, does it take away from a traditional public school or whatnot? And my answer is like, well, this is public education. Education is a public good. Not in the raw economic sense, but in a political sense. Like, we've all identified education as something that we all want and that society benefits from. So if that education is still being produced, even at a value or exceeding expectations, why exactly would you fight that? I had this conversation with a gentleman earlier today, and he said, I don't like the idea of our tax dollars going to religious schools or whatnot. And I was like, well, why would you care if the kid goes to a Catholic school, if they get higher SAT scores, higher GPAs, and go to a good college? Why does it matter? It's like being upset that students at University of Notre Dame receive Pell Grants. It's like, that's absurd. Like, why would you care? Like, yeah, it's a Catholic school, but what's the big deal as long as they learn? And it's actually kind of really funny about that crowd, because they almost forget that the role that the church actually played in basically forming what has become the modern education, and even the modern university has basically started from religious outreach programs, which makes it all that much more hilarious. But nonetheless, I was like, who cares? It's like, if you don't want to send your child to a Catholic school, then don't. If you don't want to send your child to non-secular private school, then don't. But the idea is that these schools will compete, and that schools that perform badly will lose students, which is okay. Why would you want to lock someone into a poor performing school or a bad school just because it's a traditional public school? It's like, oh, it's tradition. It's like, it's the most illogical status quo bias that you could ever find. It's like, well, I just really like the idea of how this had worked in the past. That's why we should keep doing it. It's like, and there's no logical explanation for that. So does it take away from traditional public schools? I don't believe that, because it's proportionate in the sense that, like, the money follows the student. So, like, the funding is always proportionate. Like, if the school loses money from losing students, it still has enough money for the students that are still there, because it's proportionate. So it's like, I don't see how that's really taken away. It's like, obviously a school with a smaller student body would have a smaller staff, and you see what that hints at, and that's what teachers unions don't like. So that's really what it's about. It's not about the students at all. Those are teacher union talking points that have nothing to do with student outcomes and what's best for the child. And that's why they're terrified of parents making the decision themselves.
All right. So if you could have your ideal education system in America, what is your ultimate vision for how you'd want things to go? If you could kind of spell out the details of that. I think you already have done some of that, but if you could kind of go full circle with it.
What I would have would be somewhat of a statewide, not necessarily national, but a statewide voucher system. And these voucher credits will be somewhat adjusted for household income. So that way, how do you say this? You can meet the needs of poor and low income students, because if you just have a pure voucher system, then there might be funding gaps. Like, a poor low income student might not be able to go to the best private school. You see what I'm saying? So it's like, I would have it like proportionate to household income. Like, families that make more would receive less for their voucher, and families that make less would. So that way that each student will be able to actually attend the school of the parent's choice.
That's a really nice and simple vision. I like it. So moving on now to just the last question in this section, at least, on schools and school choice. You wrote an article titled "School Choice and Racism, a Myth Devoid of Context." I think I got that off of Intellectual Takeout. You've written another rendition of it, I think, for, I think it was Foundation for Economic Education. I think you wrote maybe there, or it was somewhere else. Could you explain what was the kind of basic argument in that article, and why racism and school choice somehow go together, or allegedly go together?
Okay, so one of the big issues in school choice is, like, there is, and this isn't like fictional, there's what you would call de facto segregation, not de jure. De jure segregation is illegal. You can't do that. So de facto segregation is basically like, if I go and open a charter school in a minority community, right? Well, who's going to decide to send their kids to that school? It's going to be the kids that are underperforming in the traditional public schools that's already overwhelming minority. So what you will have is a stratification where my school may end up looking, how do you say this, very, very colorful, and and the other school may not. And people are like, well, this is segregation. And I say the main difference between this is like, it's not segregation in a forced sense. It's parents deciding to do that. And the reason that that's an important difference is because that's no different than me sending my child to a historically Black college or university. If I decided to send my child to Howard University in Washington, D.C., which is probably the most prestigious HBCU there is, nobody would call me racist for it. And nobody would go to Howard University in the middle of DC, even though like most of their students, like 97% are Black, and accuse them of supporting segregation. But but for all intents and purposes, if you actually determine segregation mean like a separate, like it is a segregated school. Nobody ever uses that term to describe Howard. They never use that term to define Bethune-Cookman University. They never use it for Florida AMU, FAMU. So they never use those terms. But it's like those schools are overwhelmingly Black, and it's not because they don't admit white students. It's only because Black students apply. So it's like, no, it's not racist. And it's like, to say that that's racist is absolutely absurd. And I don't see how you could actually look at HBCUs or even historical Spanish institution. I graduated from FIU, which is the largest Hispanic degree granting institution in the country, down in Miami, Florida. And it was overwhelmingly Hispanic, overwhelmingly Cuban. But it's not a racist school. It's not like they're saying, hey, white people don't apply here. Hey, Black people don't apply here. It's like, that's the demographic of the city. And it's the public school in the city. So the kids who couldn't afford to go to University of Miami, which cost like literally 5 times as much, ended up at FIU. And that's not a bad thing. So that's the issue is, and those are just distractions they want to trick people with. The real question is, are these kids learning? Where are the outcomes? What does a successful charter school look like? What does a failed charter school look like? And how do we stop these schools from becoming failures? The real questions or issue around charter schools is sometimes they're poorly planned out, and they end up closing early, and sometimes in really, really rare but public scenarios, they've closed in the middle of the school year. And those are the type of real issues surrounding charter schools. So it's like, I don't believe at all that the charter system has been perfected by any stretch of the imagination. There's still a lot of work to go in here. And as a matter of fact, like, there isn't really a pure voucher system in this country. Like, there's always limitations. Like in Florida, for example, you're for where I went to, Jacksonville, Duval County Public Schools, you can choose to send your kid to another public school, but there were conditions on it. Or charter schools, like you had to argue there was something wrong with the school that they were at. So it's like, there's not really the free movement and choice between parents. And that's the kind of robust competition you need for the model to work. Like, from a theoretical standpoint, where the competition of good schools will force bad schools to either get better or close down, which a bad school closing down isn't a sad thing. I'm not really sure. That's another thing where people get very attached. It's like, that's a failed institution, let it go. It's like, you don't have to, live and die by it. So when good schools grow and bad schools fall, and the students make their way to the better schools and outcomes improve, for that model to work, you need choices and competition. And most charter school or school voucher systems are very limited. They only allow, like, how do you say, for example, very poor kids to participate. They only allow you to choose between public schools and charters, or they allow you to use charters and public schools, or traditional public schools, but not private schools. Like, my thing is, you need every school basically competing for all the students, and letting the parents decide. And these schools will basically market themselves on the basis of their student outcomes, and that's how parents will know where to send their kids. That's how it's supposed to work. There's no pure voucher system that's ever really been put forth in this country.
Well, I think that's a nice place to leave off and move on to our next subject, which is definitely more controversial. It's obvious that guns are also extremely controversial in America right now, especially a very touchy subject. You talked a little bit on Facebook, because we're friends, about your experience with the whole gun process. If you want to talk about that, you can. But the first question that I really have to also provide context for this discussion is really, what do you think is the grounding or underlying philosophy for why we have the right to bear arms? And do you think it's still legitimate?
Wow, that's a phenomenal question. So to answer, the Second Amendment stands there to protect against tyranny. That is the primary purpose of that. It is not an amendment to protect hunting, even though the Supreme Court has ruled that individuals do have the right for armed self-defense. That's not the primary purpose of it. Like if you read it, it doesn't say anything. It mentions a milita, it says well regulated, shall not be infringed. So when you look at the text, it's like there's nothing about hunting in there, right? So when people are like, oh, you want to go hunt, there's nothing about sports shooting in there. There is something that implies military action of some sorts. It's like, so it's like what is there for, and even more so if you go back and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's Federalist Paper number 46 or 47. Madison wrote extensively about how the European kings and queens and elite basically refused to trust their citizens with guns. That's true to this very day, and like he speaks about how the American citizen has the advantage of being armed. That is a very, very key insight. What he's saying is he understands that allowing people to be armed is basically necessary for a free state. And I believe, and so some people say, does that argument hold up? Like, can small arms be effective against a well-oiled military and an organized federal government? And my answer to that is, first and foremost, I'm not a tinfoil hat advocating a civil war of any sorts. I hope for all of our sake that this country can survive and get along without anything of that nature. And I don't believe there's any imminent civil war approaching us. So, but for the fun of it, let's do a thought exercise. It's like the military is probably one of the most conservative areas of our federal government, and I say that in terms that they're more patriotic and they tend to be more right wing. So it's like I'm not sure if you can get them to turn their guns on their fellow citizens. It's one thing to send people to war to fight people who don't look like them and whatnot, but it's really, really hard when you take that soldier from small town Georgia, small town Kansas, and tell them like, hey, we want you to go kill people that look like you, talk like you, eat the same food as you, literally learn the same history as you down in Texas or California or Arizona or something like that. It's a way different ask. So it's like the idea that you can just turn the military on to the civilian population in this country is a little bit dubious. It's like you're going to have a high desertion rate. Secondly, a lot of conventional weapons of warfare just don't make sense to use in a civil war against your own people, especially if you plan to maintain the trust of governance. Like, what are you going to do, nuke Dallas? Like, I mean, you're going to have people that are loyalists and rebels that are there that die. So it's like, what is the calculus for that? It's like, what are you going to do? Like, how do you bomb just the rebel factions when we have a very urbanized mixed environment? It's like, so it wouldn't be a very easy war to fight. And that's where the biggest issue in terms of that wouldn't be like, oh, they have tanks and drones and nukes and stuff. It's like, it doesn't matter. You won't know who or where to kill. Like, how do you know what side of the issue I'm on? Right. So it's like, so the real big issue there will be communications, and especially in an age with encrypted communications where the government struggles to decode WhatsApp messages. I'm not completely convinced. And also it'll be a guerrilla warfare. It's like where you look at whoever is orchestrating it at the top, like you wouldn't even be able to walk outside. There's so many guns out here, somebody will take a pop shot. Like if Donald Trump made himself grand supreme dictator of the United States, somebody's taking a shot at dude. It's like we live in a country where people have, Barrett 50 cals that can shoot you from 3 miles out. It's like, it's not a good idea to do that in this country. And that's one of the things that a lot of people don't understand about the Second Amendment. It is actually a check and balance on governance. I'm not sure if you've ever met your senator or your congressman or whatnot, but when they come home, especially in these rural states, they don't have Secret Service. These people are basically just like me and you. They're walking around, they're on commercial flights. They go back and they are amongst the people. Like, On Capitol Hill, they have a little security, but these people don't have like 24/7 Secret Service around them. Some do when you're in like leadership, like maybe Nancy Pelosi, maybe, Harry Reid, or not Harry Reid, but Chuck Schumer. So it's like some of these people do, but like the most of them, like they live in our neighborhoods. They're right around here. Like it's not hard to get to them. So when they govern, they understand that there are freaking tinfoil hats out there. Like what happened at the congressional baseball game with Rand Paul and Steve Scalise is like they understand that there are tinfoil hats out there that might take a pop shot at them. So, and I think that moderates our politics. I think it would be a lot worse if our civilians didn't have guns, because you have to go back and you have to live amongst the people. And that can be a very scary thing if you're trying to do dangerous things for freedom.
Right. The people can express, even with force, if they're displeased with you or if they really think that you violated some fundamental right of theirs.
And I would never advocate that. I want to be very, very clear. I definitely believe we should vote and be peaceful as possible. I don't think you should shoot at your legislators or anything crazy. I don't think you should start a civil war. I think that's a terrible idea, mostly because it's not worth the bloodshed. I don't see any issue we're currently facing that needs Americans to kill each other. Like, I don't think Americans should be killing each other point blank, period. But at the same time, we, especially out here in the Midwest and on these great vast plains, we all got a lot of guns and they're not going anywhere. It's just like an issue of pragmatism. Most of them are unregistered. You wouldn't even know where to look for them. So it's like, by some estimates, there's more guns than people in this country. And especially with our low birth rates, it's probably going to remain that way for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, true. And a lot of people who are proponents of, let's say, stronger common sense gun laws, or whatever that term means, they'll usually say something like, well, we're not taking away your right to bear arms. What we're doing is we're just trying to, make things more reasonable. Take out the AR-15s, take out the assault rifles, take out the 30-round magazines. You don't need these things, right? So you can still bear arms, but we should be able to regulate this better for the sake of public health and safety.
I like this. And this is one of those things that I always go back to. And again, like I understand everything we're saying is very, how do you say this, subjective. And I expect a lot of people will disagree, but I'm going to give you my personal opinion on the subject. And my personal opinion is basically, I don't understand what gun you wouldn't trust your fellow citizen with that you would trust the state with. Like, why exactly is it okay that our federal government has enough nuclear arms to end life on Earth? And people are like, oh, I think Donald Trump's crazy. I think Donald Trump's crazy. You trust him with a nuke, but not me. What did I do? like, why do you think I'm crazy? It's like, I think you're a personally sane person. So why would I not trust you with nukes? Why can't you have a little pocket nuke in your basement just in case things get weird?
A pocket nuke?
Could you have a little pocket nuke, a little football back there? And it sounds absolutely ridiculous, and people are like, oh, well, and it's like, well, when you think about it, if you can't trust the people with these weapons, why can't you trust a government consisting and comprised of the people? It's like, what changed random human A that makes him extra special and invaluable once he becomes a official government employee? It's like, there's nothing to believe that. So my argument is, if you don't believe I should have these guns, all right, take them from the state. That's how I see it. And I mean that, and I mean that even with nuclear weapons. I don't believe anybody in this world should have nuclear weapons. In a perfect world, they wouldn't exist. So it's like, if they have tanks, then why can't I have a tank? It's like, when you look at oppression, there's only so many ways in which your law-abiding citizen is oppressed. They're either oppressed by gang violence, like basically thugs or criminals that are breaking into their homes, that shoot up their blocks, they taint their property values, things of that nature. And when you pass these restrictive gun laws, who's exactly going to comply? It's like, it's not going to be those people. It's not going to be the gangbangers. So it's like, okay. So it's like, who are you reducing the ability to protect yourself? So then it's like, who else oppress people? It's like the state. Like, we look throughout history, the state has been one of the most like prolific mass murderers in human history is like governments. Governments start wars. They turn guns on their peoples. They, like governments kill a lot of people. They do it to this very day. It is like government is an extremely dangerous institution. So the idea that we should just trust the state with our security as if that's never gone wrong, or if voting alone is enough to prevent it. Like, look at Venezuela, right? It's like, oh, well, yeah, it started off very democratic. It just didn't end that way. So even if you look at what's going on to a lesser extent in Brexit, they can't even vote their way out of the EU. Now people are trying to have another vote, and they're going to probably, and this is a common tactic in terms of policy and agenda setting. If you don't like the results of the first vote, make them vote again and vote until you get the results you like. And so like you have this issue where it's like, for a free state to remain, to keep its sovereignty, for free people to keep their autonomy away from the state, to have my own, bodily autonomy and whatnot, is like, I need my guns. And it's not because, how do you say this, I plan to fight a revolution. I absolutely don't. I hope it never comes to that. I really don't see it. I probably don't think it'll ever happen in my lifetime, if it ever happens at all. But it's like, it goes to old phrase, it's like, I'd rather have a gun and never need it than to need a gun and not have it.
That's true. And I've also noticed that this is a strange place where communists and conservatives actually agree, because, conservatives believe that we need to check the state. I mean, libertarians too, right, with gun rights. And I've noticed that a lot of my friends who are communists, they've told me that they don't understand why people who are supposedly liberals and socialists, or quote unquote communists, don't support gun rights, because they also believe, right, that for their eventual revolution, if they ever get to that point, they want to have their gun rights. So it seems to not be something that's just owned by one particular side of the aisle. I think it's a universal concern.
It is one of those things. It's evangelized by the American right, the whole gun rights issue. But you're absolutely right. Karl Marx was a really big fan of gun rights. That's one of the things of all your failed communist revolutions. They always seize the guns, but Karl Marx was like, you can't take the guns from the workers. He was very clear about that. And the first thing these communist authoritarians do is what? Disarm the workers. So it's like that's one of the few things Marx got right, and it is a very short list. But and obviously, oddly enough, even though it's one of the few things he got right, it's one of the first thing Marxists are willing to forget and disregard.
That's true.
So it's sad, but yeah, obviously, you for the same reason, he was like, if you disarm them, you allow rampant exploitation by the state and the powers that do. It's like when you disarm people, all you do is centralize the power. It's like disarmament, common sense, gun reform, and I don't even. My thing is, if I can't have 100-round magazine, then okay, the state can't either. Like, if I can't have AR-15s, then it's like the police can't, the military can't. It's like, we don't want to send them to war without an AR-15. Don't send them to war then. It's like, why do I have to give up my guns and they get to keep them? What makes the military infallible? We know they're not. What makes police infallible? We know they're not. So it's like, oh, well, it's dangerous for me to have. It's dangerous for them to have them. They kill way more people than civilians. So it's like, I don't see the issue. And I'm not anti-military or anti-cop. I'm just saying, logically, I don't see why I would make that concession without the state making equal.
Well, I'm sure that somebody would maybe argue, like the state has a special obligation to maintain peace and order in the citizenry. And because, like, if you just allow people to have guns in general, so I'm playing devil's advocate here, you have this kind of wide, disparate array of all sorts of crazy people who can have guns. With the state, at least you have some type of regulatory measure. You can kind of identify who these people are. And this is like the special obligation of the state to protect us, right?
Well, I'm not sure if you've ever been in our minority communities, especially Chicago. Ask them how that special obligation is going. Ask them if they feel safe and if the state is doing enough. And I'm pretty sure, even if I don't necessarily agree with the political philosophy, we're going to align a lot in how we answer that question. And the reason that is because that's all, and this is where we're bridging theoretical with the practical. Is like what the theoretical role of the state in terms of providing protection doesn't bring back the whole fact, or doesn't disregard the fact that it isn't infallible in its nature. It's like I remember one terrible event was like our military bombed a Doctors Without Border hospital in Afghanistan and killed a crap ton of surgeons and civilians in the process of. And basically all we said was, sorry, wrong maps. And it's like nobody went to jail over it. Nobody was court-martialed. It's like those kind of things, like drone strikes killing children overseas. It's like terrible, terrible things happen with the state having power and weapons, and they've done it here. I mean, like you had Ruby Ridge, which was basically a bunch of freaking federal agents killed and slaughtered a bunch of I guess how do you say this? Problematic citizens, to say the least. You had Waco, so it's like the idea that that our federal government is an efficient means of protecting us, and it's particularly our liberty, because I can't see how anybody can trust the state freedom, especially just solely the state, is absurd. And even if to the extent that you can control the state with just votes alone, you still have the fact that you have the majority of the tyranny, in which you can have massive crowds, or the majority basically oppress a minority. And I mean, I feel like if any person of color in this country that even has a brief understanding or a basic understanding of our history can understand how that can happen. And this even applies to the members of the LGBTQ community, can understand how that can happen. So there's nothing about votes alone that protects freedom and liberty and individual liberty. So, and those are kind of the most cherished values of this country. That's what makes America, really. That's what makes any free state free. And I do believe America may be one of the few free countries in the world. I know by some metrics, everybody's like, oh, Europe's just as free. They have speech codes. You get arrested for and investigated for things you tweet, which will never happen here.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like any country with a speech code where you're literally not allowed to speak your mind isn't a free country. They're managed socialist states where the government owns everybody and they take over half of their productive value through taxes, and that's sad.
My personal opinion about this whole gun issue is that I think most people, so this is actually, when you look at what common sense gun laws are, or when you look at what common sense is just in general, I think anybody would be listening to you and recognize that you have valid points to make. And even this is not really a partisan issue from from in my mindset, at least. This is not an issue that liberals and conservatives should be divided on. When you look at somebody like Malcolm X, right, the picture with, I think it was an AK-47, just everybody recognizes that we need some basic protection for ourselves in order to keep the state checked, in order to have balance and so forth. So I think the main thing is just it seems as if a lot of people don't like the character of gun defenders, and they think oh, you're just hypocrites, or you don't care about the people who died.
I see that issue, and one of the things is first and foremost, everybody cares. And when something as tragic as a school shooting happened or a mass shooting, that's terrible. Nobody likes that. And I'm gonna be honest, as a gun owner, I can't think of anything worse in terms of that, because I get blamed. I'm blamed. It's like people who defend gun rights are the first people to get blamed when something goes wrong like that. And we're the first people to lose our freedoms. I think the worst thing there's nothing I hate more than mass shooters, because when that happens, not only do people die, but the response is to restrict and take away my freedoms. And we all know that's not going to bring anybody back from the grave, but that's the response. And I have to defend my freedoms. And that's terrible. So the question is, can we prevent things like this from happening again? And I do believe we can. And one of the big things I always tell people is there's states and countries that have strict gun controls that are far more violent than we are. Mexico's one of them. Honduras is one of them. So there are countries like that. There's countries in Africa that are far more violent than we are, that have very strict gun regulations. And what people always respond is those don't compare to America. America's the only developed country with this problem. And what they do is they concede an awful lot with that argument. They just don't realize they are. They're saying, hey, gun control doesn't save lives. Development do. Opportunity do. It's when people have something to live for, when they're not in desperation, they don't kill each other. And I was like, that's an amazing. They don't realize they're making that. And I was like, so where when you look at where violent crime, not just gun crime, violent crime in general, it's almost always on this lower socioeconomic scale. So why would I tell people this? I was like, oh, well, we can end our war on drugs. Um, we can address our school reform crisis, right, and our education crisis, and we can provide criminal justice reform that really does a good job of integrating people back into society, so they don't have to reoffend, and we could do a lot to reduce gun violence and this crime without changing a single gun law. Like I think ending the war on drugs might half it alone.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me also that the assumption is that if the government passes a gun law, gun violence is going to be reduced, and we're just going to, be in a safer place or whatever. But then, people talk about how, oh, you can't just have these simplistic views on issues. You need to consider the underlying factors. Take terrorism, for example. When people want to blame maybe the person's religion as being the source of
Mm-hmm.
terrorism, they'll say, no, you need to do this multivariate complex analysis of the conditions that radicalize people. And then it's like on the gun issue, well, if you pass a gun law and you do a background check, that should be good enough.
So I want to be very honest. I do believe you could get very, in some cases, uh, aggressive with certain gun policies, and I do believe there are some gun laws that could save lives. Like universal background checks won't stop mass shootings, but if you had them nationwide, it would make it very hard for criminals to get guns that will show up in regular, like regular gang violence or homicides and things of that nature. So that is a loophole that I do believe could reduce gun violence. That has potential. It makes sense there. So it's like I don't think that how do you say this, gun control or whatnot has no potential to reduce gun violence. That's a very dishonest position. There's definitely logical reasons and research that supports such conclusions. The question is there a way to reduce gun violence without limiting our freedoms? And I believe that's something nobody's talking about. It's like, can we all keep our guns and take a different approach? And I believe the answer to that is absolutely. I think absolutely. Like I just said, like what if we didn't harass people over things as petty as marijuana? what if we, what if people didn't have to shoot each other for or settle disputes outside of the criminal justice system, outside of our court system? So it's like we can't even, and it's like a lot of that is what drives it. It's like when you think about prohibition of alcohol, that's where organized crime started in this country during the Prohibition era, and people were shooting and killing each other over liquor bottles. That sounds absurd now. Like who gets shot over liquor? Like nobody, and it's because it was brought out of the dark market. So that's my point. I'm like, you could do a lot of things that without actually trampling on freedoms. And then my second point would be like, gun violence has substantially decreased in the last 25, 30 years. So we're not getting worse at this. We are getting better, and we've been able to do that while actually loosening gun laws. When the assault rifle ban expired, I believe in 2004, if I'm not mistaken, it's like gun violence didn't shoot up now because everybody has these scary black rifles. Actually, those scary black rifles rarely account for like an extraordinarily small. I think some metrics between 3 to 1% or less than of all gun crime, but everybody swear the AR-15 is like this little devil of a weapon or something. I was like, no, most gun crime is handguns, not AR-15s or rifles of any sorts. So the question is like, how can we reduce these? And it's like, yeah, we can actually teach people. We can do what I always, gun safety first and foremost. That can reduce some, but it's like that'll be still marginal. And it's like, well, what's the thing? It's like, it's about valuing life. People think that's a joke. And it's like, that's one of the things that American conservatism makes the argument for. It's like you value life from the moment of conception all the way throughout to the end, to your natural end. And I'm like, if you teach people to value life, and I mean, you teach them that. I mean, you teach them in school, you teach them that, you teach them in the home, you teach them that. Like, I can never imagine killing another man, especially anything outside of a very life and death self-defense scenario. Like that has no appeal to me. And it's like the question, why do people want to hurt each other? And I get back to it, it's like these things are like these are zones. Like most Americans have no problem avoiding gun violence. Like, yeah, you have very rare like mass attack events or mass shootings, and those are extraordinarily rare. Like you're more likely to die in a car crash and be killed in one of those events. So it's like when you talk about most mass shootings or whatnot, those are gang shootings, drive-bys, things of that nature, which are very, very, very how do you say this? They're very contained to specific neighborhoods and specific cities. It's like all of Chicago isn't dangerous. There's really nice real estate in Chicago. There's multi-million dollar homes and condos, some really nice neighborhoods. There's very great schools, University of Chicago, Northwestern's right out there. It's like there's amazing institutions and neighborhoods in Chicago that anybody would feel safe living in. It's the South Side of Chicago, and even on the South Side, it's problematic neighborhoods, and it's all contained, and it's where people are the poorest, distraught, and left out of our system. So we need to bring these people and integrate them into what I would call gainful employment. And gainful employment is very different from just employment. Employment isn't always gainful in the sense that you're better off for it, or in the sense that you're making progress towards your life goals. Like some
All right.
people.
So before we move on to our last section, I do want to ask you one more question. So you did write an article, I think it was titled red flag gun laws turn due process on its head. And red flag laws are usually proposed as kind of like a nuanced middle ground between, like you don't want to just go in and take somebody's guns, but if somebody kind of seems suspicious and your neighbor calls an officer to come down, that seems kind of more reasonable, because then, it's not state intrusion necessarily. You have like somebody keeping out kind of, community oriented gun control. I was interested in what your argument was in particular there concerning red flag laws.
Okay, so red flag laws, before the state can take anything from you, you must be first accused of a crime. Red flags skip that entire state, or that entire step. Like, you're not accused of anything, it's just a suspicion of. Now, this is like all draconian 1984 authoritarianism, like, or what is that, Orwellian in its nature. And it's freakish, because you read those books in high school and you think, oh, that can never happen, and then people literally try to construct it, and it's like, oh god, no, what a terrible idea. This is such a terrible idea. ACLU, which is super gun control organization, an organization that's literally on the record as saying it doesn't believe in the private individual right to bear arms, and its constitutional analysis of the Second Amendment, another debate. But they've come out and said, well, you can't do that. This is literally civil asset forfeiture, which is a very problematic program where basically the government steals people assets without them being accused of a crime, just a suspicion of. It's just that for guns. And on that is based on rumors alone. Like, California has opened it up, so it's like coworkers, ex-girlfriends, neighbors, basically anybody can just be like, hey, I think he's crazy. Go check him for guns. They don't even have to know you have them. Like, it's the most insane thing in the world. And it also goes back to Big Brother, and that's what makes it Orwellian. It's like how the citizens are basically encouraged to watch each other and police each other for the state. It's kind of like, that's exactly how North Korea functioned. That's not a function of a free society. So it violates due process. And due process is the only clause that is mentioned in the Constitution twice. It's in the 5th and 14th Amendment. So it's like, this idea was mentioned twice, once by the founders in the Bill of Rights, and then again in the 14th Amendment, like, I believe over 100 years later. And people are still messing it up. Like, it is such plain English. It's like, no, you can't just rob people of their private property off of rumors. But we're still doing it. We're still doing it with civil asset forfeiture, which has been reined in, but it still needs to be dealt a death blow. We're doing it with guns now. So there's no way somebody can say that's not a gun grab. It's like, of course it's a gun grab. And now the thing that makes it even more disturbing than just regular private property is that they're doing it to another right. They're literally seizing your ability to exercise your Second Amendment rights. And they're doing with no process at all. And then it flips it on the head. And this is where it comes. You have to go and petition the court. So the burden of proof of a crime you never committed with intentions they have no proof of. You have to go and beg the state or a magistrate of the state, an officer of the state, to basically give you back your rights that you did nothing wrong to be denied.
Mm.
And is absolutely insane. And my thing is, we would never, ever, ever, ever do that for another constitutional right, or even pseudo-constitutional rights. Like, they're my favorite pseudo-constitutional right, and I say pseudo because it's not a real constitutional right. You can't find it in there, is abortion. And it's like, can you imagine saying that you have to petition for an abortion? Feminists will lose their minds. And that's not even in the Constitution. So can you imagine somebody saying you have to petition to talk on a street corner?
Mm.
It's insane. Nobody is like, you wouldn't accept that with any other right. And it's like, so they forcibly take your rights away from you, and they make you petition for them back. And somehow people think this is a good idea because we're doing it for guns. But at least the ACLU, to their credit, was like, well, yeah, it's guns today, but it could be anything tomorrow.
Mm. Yeah. And that's really bad looking at it, right? It's a presumption of guilt automatically, not a presumption of innocence.
And that's what we've been moving towards. Like,
That's
when you
true.
hear, like, you saw the Kavanaugh hearings, and that was an absolute crap show. But like the presumption of guilt is like, now that's a new favorite. And I don't even want to call it the left. I say that's just postmodernism. It's like, once you've been accused of something, you need to provide some kind of definitive proof that what you've been accused of isn't true, which switches the burden of proof. Like, the presumption of innocence is a legal standard. The burden of proof is a logical standard. If you tell me right now that you have wings and you can fly, that's on you to prove that. That's an allegation that's kind of outlandish. So you have to provide proof of that. I don't have to prove you can't fly. Like, I didn't level that ridiculous, assertion. I didn't make such a bold claim. So it's like, I don't have to prove anything. So that's the nature of it. It's like they're doing the burden of proof fallacy, and they switch it over. And you see that happening here in the case of the gun laws. It's like, I'm going to make you prove that you're not dangerous. It's like, you have no proof that I am. You're the one claiming I'm dangerous with no proof. Mm. And there's also a second aspect of this. We do have most states, I think it's 47 states, have something that has basically the equivalent of a mental health check-in, where basically your family members can call and think like, hey, my cousin, son, he's crazy. Like, he's going crazy. He's saying crazy stuff on Facebook. He's outside. He's yelling at a cactus. Nobody knows why. The cactus didn't do anything, or he's punching a tree repetitively. And the police can come and they can go and give you a psychological evaluation and basically ask you what's going on and all that kind of stuff. So those laws already exist in a lot of states, where it's like, if somebody's just acting way out, they could basically be involuntarily committed if they're actually crazy. So it's like, why do you need the guns? It's like if this is already on the books, it's like, why is it specifically for guns? Well, it's because it's a gun grab. It's like, you already have means to remove people who are dangerous and crazy out of society, that don't have, how do you say this, are not psychologically stable. And the second issue is, how are you going to take these guns? Are we going to do no-knock raids? Is somebody going to kick in my door, like how we SWAT people, but the cops are expecting guns, so I reach for my remote control and get shot in the face? Is that what we're going to do now?
Man, yeah.
And I mean, it's happened already. This isn't theoretical, in the sense like, this has happened to people. So it's an absolutely absurd idea. It's insane. Like, I can't understand why people like it so much, but it's like, at the same time, I do, because it's about control.
All right, let's move on to our last and final section. Do you have time to? I reduced it down to just 3 questions. Do you have time to kind of like answer each one of them individually, or would you mind if I just kind of put the 3 together and then had you like kind of address all of it at once?
Shoot for the hip.
Okay. So I have 3 different questions, and they're all really brief, right? So the first one is, I've seen some of your articles. You've written about Trump's Tax Cut and Jobs Act. My question is, has that been successful in your metric? The second question, concerning what was it? It was this article titled "Why Taxing the Rich Always Ends Up Landing on the Middle Class Instead." Could you discuss the argument there? And the third thing is just people think that democratic socialism is benevolent, but is there something malign secretly underpinning it? So those are my
Okay.
three.
All right, all socialism, all government is predicated on force, so it doesn't matter if you vote in oppression. It's the most irrelevant thing in the world because democratic institutions aren't infallible at all. Like they're very, very corruptible. That's what we saw in Venezuela. That's what we saw around. We've seen that around the world. And also, a lot of people don't know this, but China, although it's a crap democracy, it's considered a democracy in the sense that, like, yeah, they have elections, people vote. It's just the candidates are carefully selected by authoritarians. So it's kind of like it's one of those things where it's like voting itself doesn't do anything, but it's a process of legitimizing the government, and that's really what it is. It's not an actual safeguard against tyranny. That's not. It wasn't that way in Nazi Germany. It wasn't that way, and it's not that way in Europe right now, where their parliamentary systems are being wrecked by right-wing nationalists. And they're like, oh no, we had this beautiful world order thing planned. It was going to go great, kumbaya. And then it's like, oh, well, that's not going well, huh? It's like, so everybody loves democracy. I always quip until your team loses, right? So that's it's like is democratic socialism. I mean, it's a cute concept, but it's like there's nothing inherent about putting the word democratic or even adding the democratic process that stops it from becoming authoritarian process. Like there's no institutional balances that prevent that, especially if your argument is to remove those balances to make it more and more democratic. Then you just can basically veer closer and closer to mob rule, left-wing populism, which is exactly how authoritarian Venezuela was built. So the second question, I believe, is why taxing the rich always lands on the poor? Because the rich aren't stupid. I had a friend that was on the left ask me this, and it's like I'm watching the elections. Let's say I'm your neighborhood billionaire, right? Because we all have one of those. But I'm your neighborhood billionaire, and I was like, oh, AOCs, we're gonna tax everybody, and it's like, oh, Democrats, we're gonna tax the rich. Like, okay, or Bernie Sanders, Bernie Sanders was elected president November the 6th. Where he has all the people in Congress that are like, oh yeah, we're going to raise the tax to 70%. We're going to tax wealth like this. The first thing I'm doing is hiding my assets. If I have to divide my assets up so they're not like I'm worth less than 10 million or whatever the cutoff is, then my infant daughter is going to be worth $2 million because she owns a ranch and she's a toddler. My income, I'm going to slash that because everybody, all my kids and whatnot, they're all going to get they're all going to get checks from the firm, even though they don't work there, to prevent it from being taxed. And then in the worst case scenario, I'm moving it overseas so you can't touch it. I'm going to move it overseas. And all of this is going to be legal because I'm going to do it before you can ever take your first vote.
Mm-hmm.
I have a whole team of tax accountants and financial advisors that are here to make sure I get it before you can ever change the laws. So by the time you can't retroactively apply the law in this country. So it's like, I'm going to be free and clear, and they're going to have to get the money from somewhere, and it's going to be the middle class. That's how it works in Europe. A lot of people forget that about socialism. It's like the Swedish pay taxes. It's not just the rich that pay taxes in Sweden. It's like the middle class has like a 50% tax burden.
All right, and then the last question was just your thoughts on Trump's Tax Cut and Jobs Act.
So I think the tax cuts was very stimulatory. I think it did help push the private sector and hiring. I am a little disappointed that I didn't see the wage growth that I really wanted and anticipated. I was hoping that it could jump up to as high as 5% or 4%. It just didn't reach that. So that is something that is very disappointing, that wage growth is elusive. On the wage issue, wages are higher than ever, even adjusted after inflation. They're just not growing faster than ever, which is the issue. It's like people want more wage growth in terms of inflation adjustments, and that's been the biggest disappointment. But that's not just unique to the Trump administration. That was the case in the Obama administration. It was somewhat the case under the Bush administration. It's been somewhat, wage growth just hasn't been the same since the 90s. And it's not just America. It's that way in Europe. It's that way in Sweden. It's that way in UK. It's that way in Germany. So wage growth isn't booming anywhere. It's like you can go look at countries with higher unionization rates. They have a wage growth problem. So it's like the most how do you say, stupefying thing we're dealing with in econ, especially labor econ. It's like in the entire developed world, wages are growing slower, and it's like, why? And nobody really has a good answer.
Well, Raheem, I want to thank you for coming on to the show and really providing your economic insights. This is probably one of my favorite episodes because, I was dealing with a lot of like ethical and moral issues, but here we're getting to more practical stuff, and I really enjoy hearing experts talk about the fields that they love, and especially more pragmatic and practical fields. So, thank you, Raheem.
Thanks for having me on. Take care.
Yep. All right. And this has been our episode for Intellectual Conservatism. I'm going to have a lot more episodes over the summer, new guests, so just stay tuned. All right. Thank you.